Hello and welcome to Books from Your Therapist, a podcast where we talk to therapists and mental health practitioners about their mental health related book recommendations. By mixing book talk with mental health, we hope to open up the conversation around books your therapists may have suggested and make them more accessible.
This podcast is not a substitute for mental health care. It's for educational and entertainment purposes only. I'm Amanda Throckmorton, a marriage and family therapist in California.
And I'm Tara Kremen, and I work in the book industry in Toronto, in Canada. In this episode, we're talking to Dr. Kathleen Smith about her new book, True to You, A Therapist's Guide to Stop Pleasing Others and Start Being Yourself. Kathleen is a licensed therapist and mental health writer who lives in Washington, D.C. An associate faculty member of the Bowen Center for the Study of the Family, she teaches Bowen family systems theories to leaders around the world. Breaking down therapy concepts into witty, relatable stories for readers, she has written for popular publications such as Slate, Salon, New York Magazine, Psychology Today, and more. And she is the author of the popular newsletter, The Anxious Overachiever.
Kathleen Smith's latest book, True to You, is a relatable self-help guide for people who want to learn to live less focus on others' reactions and more confidently by their own principles. Kathleen uses examples from the lives of her therapy clients to explain how we borrow confidence, calmness, and beliefs from our relationships, and offers actionable steps and exercises for building a life with your own best thinking. With a healthy dose of humor, she unpacks the science of our social nature, explaining why we try so hard to be what others want us to be and how we can start living from the inside out.
And for our second book, we're discussing The Social Lives of Animals by Ashley Ward. In this book, biologist Ashley Ward takes us on a wild tour across the globe as he searches for a more accurate picture of how animals build societies. Ward drops in on a termite mating ritual while his guides snack on the subjects. He visits freelance baboon goat herds and swims with a mixed family of whales and dolphins. That just sounds adorable. Along the way, Ward shows the social impulses we've long thought separated humans from other animals and that how they might actually be our strongest connections to them. It was a really fun conversation. We hope you enjoy it. And now I hope at the end of it, you'll start thinking about cockroaches writing some poetry. That was my takeaway.
So, hi, Kathleen. Welcome to Books from Your Therapist.
Hi, I'm glad to be here.
Just wondering if you could share a little bit about yourself for our listeners, like who are you, where do you work, just anything you'd like to share to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I am a licensed counselor and I live and work in the very anxious city of Washington, D.C. And I have a private practice, but I also am a part of a volunteer faculty member for a nonprofit called the Bowen Center for the Study of the Family. And that's where I did all of my training as a therapist after I finished grad school to learn and use Bowen theory. And I write a little bit about that. I sort of teach and present for different groups about kind of using systems thinking. And so I have a pretty cool job in the sense that I get to do sort of different things. I'm not just seeing clients, I'm also teaching and writing, and I really enjoy that mix of it.
Since you touched on it, can you maybe share a little bit about what Bowen theory is for listeners that might not be familiar?
Yeah, so Murray Bowen was a psychiatrist who was a professor at Georgetown University, and he sort of was the kind of the father of family psychotherapy. You think about how therapists were trained, 80 years ago, right? They're learning Freud, they're learning psychoanalytic theory, and he sort of was interested in connecting therapy to the natural world, to evolution, to thinking about how maybe the individual isn't the smallest unit, maybe it's the group or the family system. And so if you're just looking at the individual, you miss a lot about people's functioning and how it goes up and how it goes down. And so he sort of famously studied people with schizophrenia. There was this famous study at NIH where they brought the family of the people with schizophrenia onto the ward and they researched them, and they were observing how, the family didn't cause the schizophrenia, but how people, their outcomes, how well they did in life had a lot to do with how others were functioning. And so he was very curious about sort of, could you do therapy from this lens? Is it maybe you're working with the whole family, or maybe you're working with somebody who's not the identified patient, but you get more progress or sort of more bang for your buck out of that. And so there were kind of multiple entry points for things getting better. And I just found that really cool to think about. And so I work with families, but I also just work with individuals who are thinking about their relationships, and they want to be not so hard on themselves. They want to see how a lot of our behavior is kind of adaptive. It serves a purpose. We see it in in other creatures as well, not just humans. And so, yeah, I just really appreciated kind of the connection to science with the theory that I think sometimes is missing in the mental health world. And I've been trying to figure it out ever since. So that was a long explanation. That's okay.
No, it's helpful to hear because I remember studying Bowen in grad school, but I think like most folks, maybe just like a small section of that in your family therapy class. And so it was really cool to sort of be reintroduced to it through your book and remember and be like, oh yeah, like this is a cool systems theory. So I appreciate, the explanation. I'm sort of curious, like what inspired you to become a therapist?
Sure. So I've always been fascinated by humans and their stories. I'm kind of a big fangirl. I love to read. I love television shows. And so learning about families and sort of the characters in them was just very interesting to me. I also had the experience, and I had my mother die when I was in college. And I really found myself being interested in how well the family system fared, sort of in the face of that challenge. What were the effects? How did people's functioning change? And so I think a curiosity about my own family and its history kind of drew me to Bowen theory also. And how do I get more factual about people's functioning versus sort of labeling people as heroes or villains, or this person has this personality characteristic. How do you look at sort of the system as a whole? And so I found that really interesting. I think originally I had the experience in grad school of learning about the theory and going, oh yeah, my family's okay, there's not really a lot there. And I started learning more and I was like, whoa, okay, maybe there's more to learn here. And so I'm kind of still plugging away at it.
Yeah, the classic experience of everything is fine.
Yeah, and I love, meeting with people for the first time, and I draw their family diagram. Sometimes it's called a genogram, and it never gets old. I've never found a family or a system that wasn't very fascinating to me to learn about. And so I really enjoy sort of looking at it from that angle.
Thank you for chatting about Bowen theory or even putting it in your book, because as the non-therapist in the room, I have never heard of it before. So I was really intrigued about the idea. I haven't quite drawn my family dynamic, but I think that's just for the fact that I come from a very stereotypically large Irish family where my mom is one of 14 and my dad's one of 13. And I was like, I don't know where to begin. I don't know how we could possibly do this. But so, along with your therapy work, you also have an active Substack called The Anxious Overachiever, and you're a published author. Today, we're talking about your second book, True to You. So, I'd like to learn a little bit about your career as a writer. Is this something that you've always done? Did your therapy work lead into that, or was it vice versa?
Before I was a counselor, I worked a little bit as a freelance writer and reporter, and I really enjoyed that. I always sort of knew I wanted to have a career connected with writing in some way. And then when I was in my doctoral program, I started writing a little bit about therapy and the mental health field. And I had a professor who said to me, don't get distracted. That's not what you're here to do. You're here to write your dissertation and do research. And I don't know about you all, if you ever had a comment somebody made that was like, spite can be a very motivating force, and so I thought, well, maybe that is what I'm here to do. Maybe that's what I would like to do. I didn't particularly feel compelled to be a researcher, but I really liked the challenge of explaining ideas sort of in academia or theories in the field in a way that was accessible and helpful to people without them having to go to grad school, and read sort of all these dense texts. And so I really liked the challenge of taking something that's a little bit complex and making it useful for people and easy to understand. And I think therapists appreciate that as well, something they can hand their clients and say, hey, here's something you can read that might add a little bit to the work we're doing together. Or you can keep working on yourself in your own time. And so I loved that challenge, and I love being able to explain something without using jargon. There's a lot of jargon in the mental health world, and so how do you say something as simply as possible without the sort of in-group language that people know how to speak? And I really like that challenge. And so I seem to have found this sort of interesting niche of like you've got the self-help books that are just sort of one idea over and over, motivational, you can do it. And then you've got the really sort of dense kind of theory-based text that a random person is going to pick up and maybe find useful. And so I was like, where is that middle ground of really showing a person what sort of is happening in my brain when I work with them and how I think about their challenges? And I really enjoy doing that. I really enjoy sort of telling those stories and teaching the concepts and ideas sort of in the form of a story, which is sort of what I do in my writing.
Yeah, it's very accessible, and I like your cultural references. Definitely spoke to Amanda and I were kind of chatting back and forth about like, oh, I got this one. Just like enjoying the snippets that every chapter starts at.
I was like, anyone that mentions Fleabag is okay with me.
I will use that as a technique when I present. I'll ask people in the audience to turn to the person next to them and tell them what their favorite TV show is of all time or currently. And it's fascinating to see how the vibe in the room just changes. It's such an easy connecting point. We all have, maybe a person isn't a TV watcher, but we all have stories that we're fans of and we like to talk about them. And so I find that, and I like to talk about them. So I like to include it in my writing. I think sometimes the field can kind of take itself a little bit too seriously. And so I found that just the culture references, though they will change, can be a helpful way to connect with people.
I feel like some of the ones you've chosen are timeless, so it's fine.
We'll see. We'll see.
Real Housewives, timeless.
I mean, that show will never end. But so before we go into your book in a little bit more detail, is there anything else that you'd like to share about yourself professionally or personally?
Not everything calls for humor. People have serious challenges in life, but I do think that kind of approaching the work with sort of lightheartedness, which I try and convey in my writing, is really important to me. And how do you help people see a different way of thinking about how they function? One that's not about blaming themselves or feeling ashamed. It's sort of how do you begin to kind of have fun with it and shake things up a little bit? And so that's what I try and do in my work, and sometimes better than others.
No, I definitely appreciate, I think most people appreciate that human side. I think because there's a lot of times this idea of therapists being these very, I don't know, non-human humans in some ways that I'm like, yes, like it's nice to read something that feels very readable and resonates in all these different ways. Let's talk about your second book, True to You, A Therapist's Guide to Stop People Pleasing and Start Being Yourself. What motivated you to write True to You?
Yeah, I really wanted there to be a book that helped people think about how the people pleasing, sort of how they sort of over accommodating or the caring a lot about what other people think was a very, again, I go back to that word adaptive part of our functioning. There tends to be sort of, at least in sort of the pop psychology, this world, this message of stop caring so much what other people think. When I know about humans and how our brains function, that's like telling somebody, stop breathing. Why are you breathing? This is a fun fact. I talk about this in the book about how sort of when we're not focused on one particular task, a tremendous amount of our brain's energy is directed towards wondering and guessing what people think about us or how they're going to respond to us. And that's a tremendously useful adaptation. And I think when we label like people pleasing bad, we miss that adaptation, that superpower that we have. And so I wanted to write a book that talks about the good and the bad, or the necessity of being tuned into how others respond to us, and where that kind of bites us in the butt and is not useful. And so coming at it from that sort of more scientific lens was really important to me, because I think we get the message of be yourself, stop caring what other people think. And that really ignores a big part of who we are as humans, which is to stay connected to people and to get them invested in us and to like us. That's very natural. Also, I saw this kind of in the last, maybe let's say 5 or 6 years, this trend in the culture of people I write about this in the book. I talk about how sort of as societal anxiety goes up, the more you have people sort of anxiously borrowing answers and solutions and looking to kind of gurus and people to tell them how to live. And we also have this sort of, we're going to give everybody advice and we're going to be those people. You know, it's sort of as the anxiety goes up, we more quickly sort of borrow and lend solutions to each other. And so I also wanted to kind of have in the book this idea of maybe that doesn't have to be so automatic. Like maybe that 10th book you read on parenting isn't going to be more helpful than you just sitting down and saying, what am I trying to do here as a parent, right? Like your own thinking can be involved because we're very good at taking other people's thinking into account. At least most of us are. But how can your own brain sort of play a role in the choices you make and how you live your life? I was sort of had those two aims when I was writing True to You.
Yeah, you mentioned, I think directly from the text, this is a book for people who are masters at reading others but struggle to know themselves, which like hit me. I was like, oh wow, like we do borrow so much from others. And I guess I'm sort of curious, like who do you think would most benefit from reading this book?
Well, I'm tempted to just say humans because,
Mhm.
but I think in particular I have a strong affinity for like sort of the oldest daughters, right? I'm an only child. We tend to function more like oldest in some ways, you know. So the people who are helpers, who benefit, and people really appreciate the fact that they can recognize like, oh, is everybody comfortable? Is everybody having a good time? Is this person upset with me? Like that can be a useful skill to a degree, right? But how does it get in the way? When is it useful to just let people be disappointed or uncomfortable or not have a good time? So I think, you know, people who identify as kind of a helper, either professional or in their personal life, maybe it's the friend who's always organizing the gatherings because they know it will all fall apart if they stop doing it, you know, or those oldest kids in the family too, I think.
I also appreciate, just have to go back to the people pleasing bit and how when I hear people pleasing in sort of the greater culture, it's usually talked about very almost negatively, right? Versus I appreciate you saying like this is a really clever like adaptation to survival and to connection. So that piece just feels important because I think people hear that and they're just like, I don't want to be that, right? But I think it's nice to be like, well, actually it's super helpful as well.
Yeah, I think about sort of what's that difference between being careful and being respectful, right? The focus on the other and how they're responding to you versus how do I want to represent myself? What's my own definition of being kind or thoughtful, right? That's a little bit different than how how is everyone perceiving me right now? Because good luck trying to control that, even though we try.
It's just also probably not the best use of energy. Like I think that really came out to me from your book that like the tremendous amount of mental energy that gets put into stuff that we don't control. Like,
Yeah, that's my question for people. I don't think of it as good or bad. My question is just how's that working out for you? You know, if it is, great. You know, keep on doing it. But I think most of us would say it's not usually the most helpful place to put our energy.
if you suspect somebody is sort of falling into like people-pleasing behaviors that are probably not the most positive for them or are using too much mental energy, are there signs that somebody can look out for that they could maybe reevaluate what they're doing?
Going throughout your day, I often encourage clients to take 24 hours and pay attention to every time you try to be what someone else wants you to be, or you try to make someone else what you want them to be. Are you over directing your partner or your spouse, right? Do you agree with someone at work about something you don't actually agree with, right? Just those small ways we kind of make adjustments based on who's in the room. Again, not good or bad, but I think it's useful to pay attention to the accumulation of those behaviors and to start to look for those small opportunities to say, hey, maybe I can do this differently. Maybe I don't have to check in with somebody and say, are you sure that's okay? 20 times, they can let me know. That's their responsibility to tell me if it's not okay. How do we kind of overfunction for people in those small ways? And is that an opportunity to kind of sit with the anxiety of not getting that reassurance constantly that people aren't mad at you or that they're okay with what you did?
Yeah, that kind of leads into my next question a bit about like advice of somebody to become like a little bit less of a people pleaser. So it sounds like to first like identify kind of what you're doing. But if you had like one piece of advice to sort of change a bit of the behavior, what would that be?
I think to pay attention to what's about being kind or respectful versus what's just about calming you down. So much of what we do is about just managing our own emotions. It's less about actually being helpful to people. So the example I just gave, right, where maybe you said something, you shared your opinion with a friend, and then you check in with them 5 times about whether they're mad at you or not. That's not really about checking in on them a lot of the time. It's about calming your own anxiety. If I send an email where I share my thinking about something, you can set your clock to it's about 3 or 4 hours later, I will think I've made a huge mistake. I will need to check in with colleagues or peers and say, do you think this message was okay? I wasn't out of line here, right? That is about me using others to manage the anxiety that comes along with taking a position on something, right? And that's more about my anxiety than it is about being a thoughtful person. So I think just paying attention to those moments and being able to ask yourself, is this about doing the right thing or is this about calming myself down? And is there a different way to calm myself down than to sort of borrow that reassurance from other people? Again, that's not a bad thing to do. I'm not saying never do that, but to pay attention to how automatic it is, because that's what we tend to do. We tend to involve other people with the distress that goes along with kind of being yourself, being a person in the world. And when you do that too much, you kind of lose a little bit of that ability to do it yourself.
That's such a great example because I feel like I recently just did that where I sent like a message I felt was like fine and then I didn't get a response and then I was like, was that a risky message? And I, evaluated it. I think I sent it to friends and asked like, so I'm like, oh, that one that one I can feel because I just sort of fell into that trap. And I think that comes along with like taking risks sometimes, right? Like you're putting yourself out there, you're taking a position or a stance, and that can be super vulnerable. So when you were saying that, I was like, is she talking about me?
I do that all the time. That's all. I'm like, oh man, because I to try and be less reactive or like response so quickly, and then I second guess everything. I'm like, oh gosh. So I found your book very helpful to like identify some of this in
Yeah.
myself.
Well, that's such an ancient fear, right? Of being on the outs with the group.
Yeah,
That's life or death
sure.
thousands of years ago, or in some parts of the world today. But for most people, it's not, the stakes are not that high, but our bodies react as if they are. So I think just having an appreciation for that tendency to want to be on good terms with everybody, but that doesn't mean you have to do anything about it. It's just that I've had colleagues say it's the anxiety of just being present and accounted for.
Hmm.
It's not a sign that something is wrong.
Right.
You just did a thing,
Yeah, exactly. I know we mentioned this earlier, but I feel like this book is broken down into such a readable way, and I appreciate the chapter nuggets. And actually, I always say chapter nuggets. So when we started reading it, Tara's like, "There's actual chapter
That's great.
nuggets in this." And there's lots of great exercises for self-work, which is awesome. And I feel like it's a book that you can go back to different sections and find the section that you want to, do the self-work or dig a little bit deeper. So I appreciated that. One that stood out to me was when you talk about sitting down for your beliefs. And your quote is, sitting down isn't staying down. It's not burying yourself in education so you never have to take a position. That's distancing disguised as maturity. Woof, really, like that one just really, I think, hit me as I was reading. It just resonates so much. And can you talk a little bit about the importance of sitting down for your beliefs and why is that important?
Yeah, I think it's a practice we seldom do to sit down, or I guess you could do it standing up, but actually getting at our own thinking. It's not that we can't learn things from others, but how much of the front part of your own brain is involved in the decisions you make and how you live your life. If you ask somebody who's getting married, what are your principles or ideas of a good marriage, and who would you like to be in that? Can you sit down and write a couple paragraphs? We don't do that, but we read other stuff. People listen to relationship podcasts, so and that's great. I love listening to podcasts, but can you spend 5 or 10 minutes with your own thoughts here? And that generates a little bit of anxiety to say, what do I actually think about relationships or parenting or money or, X topic? And that can help you figure out what you need to learn more about, who you need to talk to. But it also is a good starting point. And I think so much of how we function and what we believe is just sort of automatically borrowed. And again, there's an adaptive function for that. There's a reason we borrow beliefs from each other. It's incredibly efficient. But where can you insert a little bit of yourself in that process? And what does that practice kind of look like? That's, we did that in my training at the Bowen Center. People had to write something called a belief paper, and you had to just pick a topic and write a page about what you believed about that topic. And it was a really interesting exercise. I don't think it's something people do that often these days, because there are so many people telling us what we need to believe and what we need to be doing. It's easy to just kind of go along with that.
You're speaking to a point, I think, that I feel we're in this age of overconsumption where we're just sort of consuming, and then without actually letting it saturate and understanding and integrating it, we just spit it back out, or it's such a quick and easy thing to do versus actually taking the time to sit down and write out, or even feel somatically, what do I feel in my body about this versus what's just coming from something I read last week or the week before that.
Yeah, I think it's partially because we just have so many choices compared to people, hundreds, thousands of years ago. They didn't have to make as many choices as we do in a day, or about which is great. It's a tremendous privilege to have so much flexibility and choice in one's life. But that's also very overwhelming, and it generates anxiety. And so then you have the experts kind of swooping in saying, here's what you need to do. And that's very calming.
So we're sort of in the holiday time. This is going to be released in December, and I'm thinking a lot about family dynamics and just navigating family during the holidays, because that always seems to be sort of like the pressure cooker for all of the patterns and dynamics. When it comes to parental challenges, you say there's no monopoly on maturity when we're all adults. Can you say more about this?
Yeah, I think, we often look to the generations before us to lead the way when it comes to behaving better. That doesn't always play out that way. Some people are in better positions than others to do something differently. And I'm interested in whoever that person is. That's a person I want to work with and think with. And so people forget that one way to calm down is to try to teach others how to behave better. And so that's what people will do, when they're with family over the holidays. They'll try and teach parents to behave better, siblings, other people in the family. And, again, I just go back to how's that working out? How's that working out for you? Has it been particularly effective? And it usually isn't, right? I love to tell the story of my grandmother, who her response to the anxiety of gathering was to just feed everybody all the time. She would just drop, bread on your plate constantly. It was relentless, and that's how she managed her anxiety. And for a long time, I tried to teach her to try and stop feeding people. And then finally, I recognized that that's what she was doing to try and get comfortable and calm. And I just needed to keep my focus on me and how I wanted to respond, right? And I think when people can kind of start to have fun with it and recognize, put that researcher hat on and pay attention to how people get comfortable, they get less caught up in trying to change it. They see the function of the behavior. That doesn't mean they have to go along with it, but they start to think about sort of, well, what am I doing? What's my part in this mix? And do I want to kind of tinker with it or not? It helps you kind of take the focus off of seeing one person as the person who needs to change. Or if you would just do X, then I'd be able to relax and enjoy myself.
Yeah, that feels so hard. Like I'm like, yes, yes, yes. And it's so funny, right? Because I feel like there's all these behaviors that we do that we are just not conscious of, right? Like your example of the overfeeding. I'm thinking of like, and then there you bring children in and it's like, well, now we can focus on the children and make sure the children are okay. Or, it's very, it's easy to slip into those behaviors. I am curious about folks that are maybe in their own therapy or process of understanding maybe their family patterns and maybe they're stuck in this parental blame where they're blaming their parents for all these things. Might be a big question, but do you have any advice for anyone that's stuck in parental blame?
I will ask people sort of what does it take to get more neutral about people's functioning. I don't think you need to be positive. I don't think you need to explain it away or excuse it, but I just like this idea of sort of getting factual about how people function. I think often getting more information about the family or the group, going back a couple of generations if you can, just talking to people, not asking why questions so much, just the what, where, who, when, those questions that help you see sort of what people were up against and how they responded to it, it has suddenly less to do with you than it is about sort of the response to the challenges. And that is a different way of thinking about it. And also, I think thinking of the system as a whole versus the individual, sort of like let's look at this whole group and how flexible we are or how rigid we are, how close we are, how allergic to each other we are. How does my functioning reinforce that or give the system a chance to be something different, right? That doesn't mean that everybody changes, but if you are a part of it, changing yourself does affect how the system functions. And so that's just a different way of thinking about it than what I talked about earlier, the sort of the identified patient or the identified problem, right? Is to get curious about your own part. But I do think learning a lot about the history of the system, the history of the family can certainly help. I think it takes the focus off of one particular person. I know I did this with my dad's family. I made a list of every stressful event that I could find out about for like 100 years. You put that in chronological order and you're like, we're doing pretty good. There was some stuff going on. People responded to it, and then that helped me think about it differently. And I could see some of the strengths where maybe I hadn't before.
Yeah, it's an interesting exercise to try and think about doing. I might maybe while I'm home try and get some notes from the family. I know I also I think the idea of you just saying there about being a bit more aware of everything, because I have this thing in my mind where I'm just like, when you're in your family home, I just revert back to my 16-year-old self and I can't help it. No, but I can absolutely. And changing those different dynamics. So yeah, I think it was a helpful thing to sort of consider.
Yeah. I would ask you to think about what hour of the day would you like to change it. I think people can be too ambitious. Those are strong forces. Can you be like from 11 to 12 o'clock? I would like it to
I'm going to
be
be my 38-year-old self.
exactly, and then, you can kind of give yourself a pass for the rest of the time. I think to just be strategic and see what you can do with the opportunity versus I'm going to be this sort of mature, enlightened human with my family, which I mean, I've never met anybody who could do that.
Thank you. You're giving me permission not to fail, but to adjust my expectations. So I appreciate that. I really like the idea that you had in your book of mind reading versus mind knowing. And that was something that stayed with me a little bit, as we were talking to earlier about the amount of energy that you're putting into stuff. And I think I felt a little bit seen there on just the amount of assumptions that we make on what people are thinking without actually knowing what they're thinking. So can you just speak to this a little bit about the difference between the reading and the knowing?
Yeah, I alluded to this earlier, sort of how our brains are built to be pretty good at guessing what other people are thinking or what they're about to do. A fact I love is that a human toddler can do this better than any adult primate, other than humans. So we're pretty good at it from a very young age. but how much energy goes into it versus knowing your own mind. What do I think about how I did? The difference could be, let's say you're at a party or something and you come home and wonder like, did I sound annoying? Did I talk too much? What do people think of me? The mind knowing would be, well, what's my own definition of being respectful, engaged, a good listener, a little bit courageous, whatever you're trying to be sort of in that moment. And that's more about how you want to function than about how people feel about it, or how you feel about it. And I think it's a useful practice, because we always tend to shift to the mind reading. I think that mind reading isn't just about us, though. It can also be a data point about how tense a system is. If you're very focused on what people think of you after an encounter, it could also be that the family or the organization or the group itself is going through a tense time and you kind of bumped into that, right? So I often try and check myself and say, is there really something wrong here? Or is everybody just kind of worked up right now? And that is contagious. And so that's helpful for me because I think it helps me blame myself less and it helps me go, okay, yeah, the anxiety is up. I'm going to be second guessing myself a lot when I'm encountering this group of humans because everyone is paying a lot closer attention to each other than they would in sort of calmer times.
Yeah, I think that's a good highlight. Yeah, because we're just kind of on autopilot sometimes to think that we just assume what everyone else is thinking and doing. So having those little bits of awareness, I think I found it helpful for sure, anyway, personally. So which part of the book did you find the most exciting to write about?
Yeah, I mean, I always enjoy writing about examples from the natural world. I love writing about animals and other natural systems. Any kind of example that can help people think differently or not be so hard on themselves. And, that's why I'm like, sometimes tell my clients, I'm like, go read a book by Franz de Waal, like go read Chimpanzee Politics. Like, I'm not saying that humans are chimpanzees. I'm just saying that when we think of ourselves as sort of a natural system connected to other humans, that's just a different way of thinking about it than a bunch of individuals running around who have nothing to do with each other. That's not for the vast majority of human history how we lived. It's only very modern that we're kind of isolated in the way that we are. So I love to use, examples from animals just because I think it's fun and it helps people not be so hard on themselves. So I love to kind of insert, in addition to the pop culture stuff, I really enjoyed sort of inserting those facts into the book.
And that leads very well into our second book pick, which is the book of your choosing. So let's chat about that. You picked The Social Lives of Animals by Ashley Ward. So why did you pick this book?
It's a fun read. It's not a dense academic text. It's just lots of narratives about animals that are social and how we can see ourselves and how they function, whether it's elephants or chimpanzees or even cockroaches, even insects, seeing how the group functions and what that has to do with human life as well, and how we can cooperate together and how we get into conflict with each other. And so it's often a book that I will recommend that people read if they just really kind of feel stuck or in kind of a blamey place. I said, why don't you read about animals? You read all the hard stuff. Go and read some of this, and maybe this will challenge how you think about it. I love to tell people the anecdote of, I had a guy complaining once about a bunch of his coworkers not sort of pulling their weight at work. And I said, well, 25% of ants in a colony are just hanging out. So what do you do? What do you do with that information? And that's a different way of thinking about it. Then why can't these people, like, maybe there's a purpose here. Maybe there's a function for that, for these underfunctioners. And so I love sort of how we're challenged by like what we label as dysfunctional or unhealthy. Well, if you see it in the natural world, then it must serve a purpose. We must have adapted to do this for some particular reason, right? And so maybe you need to stop trying to change that in other people. They're just like those ants. So it's a great book. I love it a lot.
I thought the writing was really good as well. Like it paired very well with yours in terms of like accessibility of the writing. And I'm glad you mentioned the cockroach because if you'll humor me for 1 second, this is a little bit long, but it was just my favorite thing that he wrote in the book was a cockroach isolated in early life is in fact a tragic figure. It grows more slowly than its peers, and even as an adult, it finds itself on the margins of society. Unable to mingle and interact properly, it struggles to join cockroach groups and has an unfulfilling love life. If only they could write, such cockroaches might produce haunting poetry of surpassing beauty and pathos about their existential misery. And I was like,
I love that line. It's great.
the idea of cockroach poetry, just I was thinking about it for such a long time.
Yeah. Yeah, I will often read that line to groups and say, I bet you never thought you would feel sorry for cockroaches, but
I
you
know.
can,
You
you know.
can. So you talked a little bit about why it's sort of important to understand the animal structures, and this book covers a whole wide range of them. Was there any group that really jumped out and surprised you in that you were like found yourself even more interested or hadn't considered something of the animal group?
Yeah, I wrote about this recently in my newsletter. I didn't know much about locusts, and he has a section in the book on locusts and how they turn from their sort of individual form to sort of, I think it's called the gregarious, so the more he calls it the party animal, right? And I was thinking about sort of the connection to humans of how we can kind of be ourselves and do our own thing, but in tense times there's just tremendous pressure to go along with the group and do what the group is doing. That's how locusts sort of survive in tense times. They sort of march forward because if they don't, the locust behind them is gonna chew their butt off. And so I was like, well, that's a great metaphor. When have I in a group felt like if I didn't keep in line or if I said something, I was going to get my butt chewed off. The stakes are not that high, right? But I think it helped me recognize how in challenging times, kind of the pressure to go along serves a purpose. Because if we were just kind of hanging out and doing what we wanted, locust would die if that happens, right? And so what are the costs of humans? Sometimes we need a little bit of a nudge from the group to kind of go along. But when is that too much? When is it not serve a purpose, right? And so learning about locusts help me think about humans that way and not be too judgmental about, let's say, times are tense in a family where there is more pressure to kind of do what others want or to go along with them, to see that it's kind of the locus in that, so to speak, and to see how over time in human history, a lot of groups we think about groups that are sort of more high demand religions. They have sort of more strict rules that served a purpose, and that helped with survival at a cost. It's a cost to people's individuality. But seeing sort of how that function, how when times are tense, things kind of tighten up. And when things are calm, things are looser and more flexible. And that was kind of cool to learn about with the locust.
I was also surprised about, I didn't realize that they were like such different, it's almost like two different animals, I guess, or
Yeah.
insects. And that what he was saying in the book about the proximity as well of like them losing like where they're living. Or I was just trying to think about it at like, so a locust, having many locusts too close to it can sort of trigger like the anxiety
Yeah.
within the locust. And I was thinking about that in like crowded settings sometimes, or when you're feeling like a little bit overwhelmed, like that sort of feel. It was interesting to learn about that in like other species as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So was there anything that stood out as like a really people-pleasing animal?
There's not one in particular that comes to mind. I mean, I think just I can't remember if this example is in the social lives of animals. I think it is. But one of the examples I talk about in my book is the chimpanzees who had to choose between grapes and carrots as a snack, and they like grapes better, obviously. But these researchers trained some of the higher ranking chimps in the troop to choose carrots, and when the other chimpanzees observed them, when it was their time to choose a snack, unsurprisingly, they chose a carrot. Because it's like, well, these important guys so they must know something we don't, right? And it made me think of social media and all those influences of like, when am I choosing the carrot in my day-to-day life just because I've seen someone else choose that? So it must be important, or that must be valuable, or the way I need to live my life, or how I spend my time, right? And so this tendency to kind of look to the higher ranking members of a group to make decisions, how that's sort of built in. That was kind of an interesting example to sort of learn about with chimpanzees.
I especially liked learning about the chimpanzee that it had a kitten as a friend and then blamed the kitten for something, which I thought was just an adorable visual, but also just like hilarious. You're just like, I think it was like the chimpanzee who broke the sink off the wall and like signed that it was like, no, it was the kitten that did that.
Yeah.
Too cute.
Yeah, we're learning a lot about what they are capable of. It's fascinating.
So the author of this book says that he often looks to animal trends when facing a big life decision. You've sort of mentioned some of the learnings that you've taken, but are there any that you've taken from animals or this book in general that we can use in our lives?
I mean, I think just recognizing how the system kind of has a mind of its own. This is kind of more of a complex example, but like I think about termites, how these termite mounds are kind of like brains in a way, because an individual termite doesn't really know what it's doing while it's building this sort of complex mound, right? But the system of termites together does. And so I think recognizing that this often, and maybe I'm just like this because I'm an only child, that I often think my way is the best way, and I know how to do things better or more efficiently maybe than the group. That's a very comfortable position for me. Recognizing that families and organizations and systems themselves have their own intelligence, and that they can do a lot more than what we can do as individuals. And there's this great quote from evolutionary biologist David Sloan Wilson. He says basically, if you want to make the most of your life, surround yourself with what he calls cooperative others. And I think we're really in a time where we are so isolated and people are so lonely. They forget how important that is for our mental health to be a part of a group of people who's trying to do something. That could be something fun. That could be something, they're trying to solve a problem or help people. It could be your family trying to figure out where to go on vacation. I mean, it can be all sorts of things. But to recognize how beneficial that is and how much more we can get done. I mean, it's cheesy, but it's true. And so that's sort of the message I will frequently leave with people, is just sort of where in your life are you with cooperative others, and how is that important for your well-being, but also for the world, right? And so I think that that's something, because we can easily sort of be individuals and isolate ourselves in that way, the people don't have as much of as they used to. And I think we're kind of suffering the consequences of that. And so just seeing sort of the wisdom and the complexity of what sort of animals can accomplish in nature as a group, I think is a good reminder for me that humans have that capacity as well. So that's kind of what I'm taking into these very anxious times.
And that they do it so naturally, right? Without the anxiety that us humans tend to add to the situation, right? Like it's all so natural versus the like clinging to control and then saying, okay, I can let this person do this piece, right? It just happens for animals, which I really appreciate. There's something reassuring about that.
Sure. I mean, there's conflict in the natural world too. It can be pretty brutal, right? But but humans, we can sort of be altruistic and care for each other in interesting ways. And I think that's kind of a cool superpower we have.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that looking at the social lives of animals leads to a more empathetic worldview?
I don't know if empathy is the word I would use. I think it certainly can be. I think I just keep coming back to that word, like neutral. How do we think about humans and human challenges in a way that's not so medicalized, which we tend to do? And how is that helpful for a system when you get out of that mindset of you're the problem, you're the one who needs to change, you're the patient. It's not that some people don't have particular challenges, of course they do, but how does it keep us from kind of diagnosing everything, if that makes sense? Because I think sometimes a diagnosis can be helpful, and then other times it's not. It's just about needing somebody to blame. And so I think that that's just a different way of thinking about it.
That kind of ties into the whole people pleasing, right? As a diagnosis too, of
Yeah.
just it being a label.
Mm-hmm. It's a function. It's a behavior. And when does it serve you, and when does it not? How do you get some choice in the matter? It's not so much sort of what's your personality type.
You've shared a lot about this book, but is there anything else that we haven't covered that inspires you about the social lives of animals?
One way to read books like these is to just kind of take your time, to just kind of dip in on a particularly stressful day, to dip into it, to read about the natural world. If there's something that interests you that you want to learn more about, to sort of take that interest as far as you can, and so maybe you get really interested in cockroaches, and that's just that's really helpful, right? And that's helpful. Like, you can make a comment like that, when you're home for the holidays, and all of a sudden maybe your family is thinking about it differently, right? Like the example I gave with the ants, right? It's just, how do you have fun with it and stay curious? And how does that curiosity kind of be contagious? So I always tell people it's not about reading particular books. It's about sort of just dipping into anything that can keep us more connected to the fact that we're a part of nature, and we have this capacity to evolve and to change. And I think that's just a easier way to think about it than all the blame.
Yeah, the only thing that stood out to me is that a lot of the book is so much of the stuff that we're learning is just recent. Like, so I would just wonder what we'll learn about animals in 20 years, that we didn't know about, like the Antarctic krill, like, like those little things. So it'd be interesting to see how it continues to evolve. Sorry.
Yeah, I think it's a lot remains to be uncovered. It's really fascinating.
Yeah. Great timing as my dog is barking. So the social lives of animals, he's just yelling something.
Perfect.
That's funny.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with us today. Can you tell us where people can find you online?
Yeah, so my Substack is The Anxious Overachiever. You can also just go to my website, which is KathleenSmithWrites.com, and all the book info and newsletter info is there. Thank you guys so much. This was fun.
Thanks for listening to Books from Your Therapist. If you're interested in the books we talked about, we'll include links in our show notes. If you'd like to reach out to us with your own recommendations, or are a mental health practitioner interested in coming on to share, you can email us at booksfromyourtherapist@gmail.com.
Happy sitting down for your own beliefs.
Happy giving yourself time to do it from like 11 to 3.